I remember back in the day when it was my final year at St. Augustine Seminary in Scarborough, Ontario, I was filming this video, interviewing the different people who were about to leave the seminary and kind of asking them questions about their life and whatnot. And I remember as part of the video, I was interviewing this faculty member, this priest who was part of the seminary community, and specifically asking him, do you have any advice for these guys including myself, who are about to leave the seminary and go on to do like arguably bigger and better things. And I remember him saying to me, well, look, I would say to them, don't turn the spiritual life into a concentration camp. Now, obviously, even though much time has passed since that priest kind of said that particular thing, I've often thought about what he said, and I think he kind of meant at least two things. And so, first of all, I think what he meant was simply that we tend to take on way too much, right? We tend to make our lives overly complicated, forgetting in retrospect that only the Lord's yoke is easy, only his burden is light. So, there's kind of that. But secondly, and kind of more to the point, I think what this priest was ultimately getting at was this notion that we tend to kind of make up our own program for the spiritual life. Kind of saying to ourselves, well, look, these different habits and structures and routines that I've made up for myself, clearly this is the path for me to become the person that God's calling me to be. This is the path for holiness, if you will. Whereas in reality, we're actually kind of making up our own thing and neglecting God's actual and particular will for our lives. And perhaps I might suggest, friends, that one of the best examples in the gospel to illustrate this particular point is found in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 21, the story of the parable of the wicked tenants. So as a matter of background, with regards to this parable of the wicked tenants, there is this landowner and he owns a vineyard. And his vineyard is awesome, right? So it has a tower, it has a wine press, it has this hedge, and he entrusts this vineyard to these tenants. And then he goes off on this journey for an undetermined amount of time. But in the meantime, the produce time comes. And when that time comes, he sends different people to kind of check up on the tenants working in his vineyard. And so he sends basically two categories of servants, both of whom are mistreated, some of whom are killed. And eventually he sends his son, and his son is seized, he's thrown out of the vineyard, and he too is killed. And with that, the gospel basically ends. Now, obviously, there's a direct parallel between this particular story and the immediate historical situation involving Jesus and the scribes and the Pharisees, right? Because you think about the scribes and the Pharisees, who were they? They were people who loved to practice religion. They were people who were so-called experts in the law. But at the same time, even though they had this mastery of the law, this love of religion, if you will, they rejected vehemently the one true Lord, the one true Messiah sent by God the Father. Now, that said, obviously this parable is meant to apply to us as well, right? Because, of course, the gospel is timeless. It's meant to apply to all people of all ages. So it kind of begs the obvious question, what are we meant to learn from this particular parable? Well, to answer this question, it's important to go back to the essential conflict in the narrative, right? And so, again, you have these tenants working in this vineyard. And there's no question they love working in the vineyard. They love it, and why not? It's an amazing vineyard. And so, in retrospect, if you look back to the story, like, what is it that they resent? What is it that they hate? In retrospect, the only thing they hate, the only thing they deeply resent, is the fact that the vineyard has a master. And it speaks to the fact that it's possible to love religion, with all the external trappings of religion, things like liturgy, habits of prayer, attending parish events, being part of parish groups, while at the same time actually hating the fact that there is the Lord. Hating the fact that at the end of the day, an essential feature of religion is obedience to God's will. Even though many times God requires me to do things that I don't want to do, and sometimes things that are even quite difficult. Okay, now at this point, to kind of further illustrate this point that I'm making, I want to share with you a few different kind of concrete examples. And so the first example that comes to mind, I remember once talking to an elderly lady who was lamenting the fact that she couldn't participate in parish events and parish groups as much as she had in the past, because she had this ailing husband at home who was basically bedridden and sick. And if you read between the lines, what she was basically saying in a certain sense was essentially this. There's these things I want to do, which I think is God's will for me and I think will actually make me holy, but for the fact that, again, I have this husband at home who requires my care. And so I find this kind of annoying, and why won't God let me do these things that I want to do for him? But it's one of those things, you hear it out loud, it sounds crazy, right? Because obviously the situation is like, look, this is your husband, and you're meant to care for him in this particular situation, right? And more to the point, you got to realize that if God requires you to be in a situation which is clearly not of your own choosing, which doesn't perhaps coincide with your own interests or your particular gifts and talents, but is part of your duty nonetheless, well, here is where you're meant to find holiness for you and for the people you're trying to serve in this particular context. Now, in contrast, I want to share with you an example from my own life, right? And so this involves my mother, who, as many of you know, is my favorite person in the entire world. Now, that said, it actually took a while for my mom to eventually become this amazing and tremendous person that she would eventually become. Not that there was anything wrong with her before, but she required a certain opportunity to become great, if you will. So, as many of you know, my father died of cancer back in 1996. But before he died, in retrospect, I think my mom really deferred to him to be the leader of the family, to be the coach of the family, in contrast to her being the assistant coach. And certainly, in the context of any sort of team, it's important to have different levels of coaches. But at the same time, my mom had it within her to be the coach. And so when my father died, it basically provided the opportunity for my mom to kind of rise to the occasion and activate all those different gifts and talents of being the coach that she always had, but needed the opportunity to kind of have these things flourish. And so as a result of this really difficult and challenging situation, which was obviously not of her own choosing, she grew and she flourished and she eventually became the person that God always meant for her to be. This person of incredible virtue and tremendous character. And I remember speaking to her about this particular point back when we were both on vacation just recently. And I remember saying to her, like, look, mom, I needed you to become that person. In retrospect, I needed you to become that person to really help me, not just as a person and as a man, but also to eventually become a priest. And if you had backed away from any of those opportunities to grow and to stretch and to change because of fear, because of selfishness, because of like whatever, that would have been bad, not just for me, but for people I would kind of encounter over the course of a priestly ministry. So, on behalf of the people of God, like, thank you. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And so recently I was listening to an episode from this really great podcast called Restore the Glory with Dr. Bob Schuchts and Jake Khym. And they had on as a special guest Christopher West, who's this really famous Catholic speaker and theologian. And so basically at the very beginning of the episode, Jake Khym was being really effusive in terms of personally thanking Christopher West for everything he had done for him and his family. And so just to kind of paraphrase what Jake was saying to Christopher was like, look, if it wasn't for you helping me with my issues and my demons and whatnot, two of my three kids wouldn't be born because probably I wouldn't be married to my wife. And so on behalf of my family, I thank you. Now, in response, Christopher West, he acknowledged what Jake was saying, passed on the glory to God, but then went on to share his own story. And so basically, there was this priest that Christopher West knew who really taught him how to be free. And so, in the words of Christopher West, this priest was the most free person he had ever known. And so basically, as this priest was essentially aging and dying, Christopher West wanted to tell him about all these different ways in which he had helped him, to help him become more free and to help him become more fully alive. But then the funny thing was that the priest said basically in response, well, that's just the way it goes. And that was that. And personally, friends, I just love that story because it really reminds us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And so when we talk about our own journey towards God and our own journey to become, the persons that God has called us to be, it's not just about us, it's about the world. And so even though there is for all of us, quite honestly, this recurring temptation to keep life predictable, to keep life safe by constructing our own plan for how life should go, habits and structures and routines which fall just short of God's particular will for our lives. We must not do that. Because if we become the persons that God has called us to be, we will truly become spiritual fathers and mothers to other people. And when they grow and they flourish and they become the persons that God is calling them to be, they in turn become spiritual fathers and mothers. And that's how you change the world. Now you might hear that and think to yourself, well, surely it can't be that easy. Surely it can't be that easy in terms of like focusing on where God wants you to be and doing what he wants you to do, focusing on a few things he wants you to do carefully and well. But the reality is, if you correspond to the cross, which is basically meaning dying to your own will to correspond to God's will for your life, as found in the simple and the humble and the ordinary, that's the only place where holiness and sanctification is to be found. And basically, quite frankly, that's just the way it goes. And may God bless you all.